When speaking of DC Comics on film, to this point there has been hardly a mention of their competition in the comic book arena, Marvel. That is not to say Marvel did not attempt anything, nor that they were not successful at some of their efforts. Alas, when it came to the few live-action Marvel forays into Hollywood, most were mediocre at best. At worst, you cannot find them anywhere except hidden corners of fandom that have swapped the terrible with perverse glee at their find. The latter I am specifically talking about a dreadful Fantastic Four movie produced in 1994 that was so bad it was never released, not even on video. It was made largely to allow the studio to retain the rights for a minimum amount of money. And that is the main problem for Marvel when it comes to live-action adaptations. Marvel, unlike DC, largely did not own its own IPs. They farmed them out to other studios for them to take all of the risk and the reward. As a matter of fact, there was no Marvel Studios until Avi Arad helped create the juggernaut that would be the Marvel Studios following Marvel's mid-1990s bankruptcy. The high point of Marvel in live action by late 1990s was probably The Incredible Hulk, a show starring Bill Bixby as David Banner and Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk. It followed a formula popular in the 1970s and 1980s wherein the main protagonists go from place to place and the plot happens. The A-Team and the original Equalizer series are other examples. The Hulk ran for 5 seasons and 80 episodes, with an additional 5 TV movies. That was the height of Marvel Comics on film before they emerged from bankruptcy. A paltry footnote in the history of Hollywood compared to what DC had accomplished over the years. The previous installments of this series showed what DC was doing without much in the way of serious competition. That ended in 1998 when Marvel showed up at the box office with Blade, a vampire-hunting badass in shades and leather that took a $45 million budget and turned it into a $131.2 million performance at the box office with an R rating. The modest success spawned 2 sequels and assured Marvel that there was an audience for its characters. 2000's X-Men would follow and open the Marvel floodgates, eventually leading to the behemoth that became the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Meanwhile, DC was stumbling along. A hit here, a flop there, both on television and at the box office. And the new millennium did not change that. The new era kicked off with a hit in the television series Smallville on the WB/CW. It pulled in audiences that current CW shows could only dream of. Starring Tom Welling as a young Clark Kent, Kristen Kroik as a young Lana Lang, and Michael Rosenbaum as a young Lex Luthor, the show portrayed the teen years of Clark Kent in Smallville as he grew into his powers while still maintaining his life as a teenager. It was a teen drama in every meaning of the phrase, including teen angst, wrestling with Clark's origin as an alien, trouble with the parental units, romantic triangles, and life lessons along the way. The show also featured Rosenbaum's Lex Luthor as he struggled with his father, Lionel, and eventually introduces Clark's cousin Kara, Brainiac, Zod, and Oliver Queen, though not the Oliver Queen of the Arrowverse. Clark, however, does not become Superman until the very last episode of the series, much to many a viewer's dismay. It was a surprisingly well-done show considering the target audience was the teen demographic, as the 10-season run indicates. It remains one of CW's best shows in the history of the network. Even the late Christopher Reeve, a skeptic of the show at its inception, came to appreciate what the show did to carry on the legacy of Superman. DC's next attempt was not nearly so successful. In 2002, the WB ordered a Birds of Prey series. Unlike the recent Margot Robbie movie that was part of the DCEU, Birds of Prey followed Barbara Gordon, one of Batman's apprentices as Batgirl, after she was shot by the Joker as revenge for Batman dismantling his criminal organization. Played by Dinah Meyer, she recovers from the attempt on her life and becomes Oracle, using her hacking and weapons abilities to continue the fight against crime in a new Gotham that Batman seemingly has abandoned. She recruits Helena Kyle, played by Ashley Scott, as the Huntress, daughter of Batman and Catwoman, and Rachel Skarsten would play Dinah Redmond, daughter of Dinah Lance, the Black Canary. The main protagonist of the show is Harley Quinn, played by Mia Sara of Ferris Bueller's Day Off fame. The show was not great, but got decent enough ratings. At first. By the time the show was canceled, it was only pulling in less than 3 million US viewers. For CW today, that would be great. For WB back then, it was less than half of what the premiere got, so it was chopped after 13 episodes. Ashley Scott reprised her role as the Huntress in CW's Arrowverse crossover event Crisis on Infinite Earths in 2019, and Dinah Meyer reprised her role as Oracle in an uncredited voice role. DC began their new millennium on film with one of the worst comic book movies of the 21st century. 2004's Catwoman was an ill-conceived mess that was so bad that the star, Oscar winner Halle Berry, appeared at the 2005 Golden Raspberry Awards to claim her statuette for the Worst Actress. Catwoman also won Worst Picture, Worst Director for Pitoff, and Worst Screenplay for John Brancato, Michael Farris, and John Rogers that night, while also being nominated for Worst Supporting Actor for Lambert Wilson, Worst Supporting Actress for Sharon Stone, and Worst Screen Couple for Halle Berry and Benjamin Bratt or Sharon Stone. The main problem with the movie is that it is not even based on the comic book character. The writers and director created a mythos of a long line of catwomen, given their cat-like abilities by a special breed of Egyptian cats, the Mao. Halle Berry's character is killed to keep her quiet after she learns the cosmetic company she works for is about to ship a new product that will poison and disfigure those who use it. One of the Egyptian cats finds her body and brings her back to life. The rest of the movie follows Berry's Patience Phillips as she tries to come to terms with her new persona and abilities, while also trying to stop her boss and his wife from shipping the product. The boss's wife, played by Sharon Stone, winds up being the bad guy. Gal? Whatever. The product turned the former model's skin hard as marble from continued use, and she became bitter and decided to share her misery with the public. The movie is one of those that is only enjoyable if you can simply ignore the heaping amounts of cringe, bad soundtrack, terrible writing, and general stupidity, and simply laugh at it all. Otherwise, it is painful, and it appropriately bombed. Hard. Like 9 figures hard. DC continued their excellent work in animated series in the new millennium. Too many to mention them all in this video. To mention the ones that were well above some of the DC fare on film in the prior decade and the start of the 2000s, DC gave us Justice League, Teen Titans, The Batman, Batman the Brave and the Bold, and Young Justice. Teen Titans in particular was popular enough to get a theatrical release animated movie in 2018, and is one of Cartoon Network's most popular series. With the new millennium, DC also started experimenting with web series and short stories, reviving an old staple of theirs from the dawn of movies. Characters like Lobo, Zatanna, Aquaman, and the ladies of Gotham like Harley Quinn, Catwoman, and Batgirl were all featured in web series or shorts used as interstitials, short pieces between shows, on Cartoon Network. The box office disappointment of Catwoman did not linger long for DC. The very next year, DC found themselves with 2 hits. The first was Constantine, a story about a scoundrel of an occult expert played by Keanu Reeves discovering a plot to bring hell on Earth. Considering its R rating, it did fairly well at the box office, and fans have been calling for a sequel ever since it premiered. A call that has recently been answered. The movie had an excellent cast featuring Djimon Hounsou, Rachel Weisz, Shia LaBeouf, Tilda Swinton as the angel Gabriel, and Peter Stormare as Satan. Stormare's turn as the devil was particularly impressive, especially given he is only in the movie for about 5 minutes. 9 years later, in 2014, Constantine would appear on television in a much altered version from the movie, which I will touch on in another video. 4 months later, Christopher Nolan would hit theaters with his vision of the Caped Crusader in Batman Begins. Unlike the campy 1960s version or the later editions of the 1990s movies, Nolan came at the idea of a comic book movie by treating it as seriously as anyone has ever treated the comic book medium on film. The world of Gotham in the Nolanverse was seemingly just a degree or two off from our own. Unfortunately, this meant that Gotham failed to live up to the Tim Burton characterization of the City of Gloom from 1989 and 1992. Instead, Gotham looked like New York City, because it was filmed in New York City. The characters had that same realism. Bruce Wayne was a rich kid trying to cope with his parents' death. He tries to kill their murderer when he gets off on a technicality, but finds the mob has taken care of it for him. With that, he goes off to find himself, eventually winding up in prison and being recruited by Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows. When he is asked to kill someone to prove himself, he burns down the fortress and flees back to Gotham to take up his duties. He also begins his career as the vigilante protector of Gotham City. It is an origin movie for Batman that audiences were never treated to. Tim Burton's Batman came to us fully formed as the Caped Crusader in a Gotham that was well on its way to becoming a cesspool. And while Nolan's Gotham was bad, it was bad in a real-world way. It was the mob that was responsible for the problems, and the League of Shadows nudging them along through the Scarecrow. The success of Batman Begins was suitably modest for a franchise that had burned fans hard the decade before, with shows like Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Nolan's initial outing proved that he was a serious filmmaker, with a vision for Batman that was more palatable, even if Gotham looked a little too much like the real world. The following year, DC would bring back another major character that had been missing from the big screens since the disastrous Superman 4 in 1987. Superman Returns marked the literal return of the Man of Steel in the form of Brandon Routh. DC and Warner Brothers committed a huge chunk of change to this project, especially for the time, costing just over $200 million plus probably another $100 million for marketing. Superman Returns tells the story of the son of Krypton returning to Earth after a 5-year absence after astronomers found the location of Krypton and Superman left to go see what he could find. In his absence, the world moved on. Lois got married and had a suspiciously aged kid. The justice system was forced to release Lex Luthor due to Superman's absence, and Metropolis went to pot. Upon his release, Lex started plotting, and the stupidest story since 1987 was concocted. Not dumber than 1987, but close. And because the story was dumb, some of the actors' performances subpar, and the overall film a mess, the movie bombed, losing the studio money. Despite this, a sequel was greenlit with Bryan Singer coming back to direct. The follow-up would have involved other Kryptonians, and Brainiac and Bizarro as the main villains. When the 2007-2008 writer's strike hit, the film was canned, and Warner Brothers decided to reboot Superman all over again. Christopher Nolan, however, was back in 2008 with The Dark Knight. This installment had some controversy when production started because fans were somewhat alarmed at the casting of former teen heartthrob Heath Ledger to play the Joker. Nobody saw the blonde Australian known for such fare as 10 Things I Hate About You, a modern take on The Taming of the Shrew, and A Knight's Tale, an almost CW version of a story about a squire taking his knight's place at a tournament, being able to pull off the crown prince of crime. and then the movie hit theaters a few months after Ledger's accidental overdose death in January of that year. Ledger was immediately on everyone's lips as a standout performer of the comic book movie, earning him numerous posthumous awards, including the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, the BAFTA for Best Actor in a Supporting Role, and the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actor in a Motion Picture. Ledger's Joker overshadowed the excellent return performance of Christian Bale as Batman/Bruce Wayne and Aaron Eckhart's turn as Harvey Dent/Two-Face. He immediately opened the debate as to who was the best Joker, and won it. It was a masterpiece of a comic book movie that transcended the genre and penetrated the mainstream, amassing over $1 billion at the box office and turning up the expectations at Warner Brothers and DC. However, 2009 showed that DC had hit another slump in theaters. Watchmen was a limited series comic run by comic book legends Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons that showed an alternate reality early 1980s. The story was about the death of a former masked vigilante known as the Comedian. In the preceding decade, there was a backlash against costumed crime fighters, and a law was passed to outlaw them. One of those who continued his work was the Comedian's former colleague, Rorschach, a vigilante who wore a mask with ink blots on it. He investigates the death and warns his former colleagues who left the masks behind. It has been considered one of the best comic book stories ever published. DC decided to do a live-action version, starring largely unknown or second-tier actors in the roles. The result was controversial, with many of the comic book's fans disliking liberties taken with the story. Others felt the movie stayed too true to the comics. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, with it being a better movie than the box office would indicate, which some consider a cult classic. In the end, the early outing by Zack Snyder wound up flopping, only bringing in $185.4 million on a budget reported to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $140 million. It did, however, bring Zack Snyder to the attention of Warner Brothers and DC, which will return him to the DC story a few years later. The beginning of 2010 saw DC try another go at bringing the comic Human Target to television. This version of Human Target basically eschewed the comic book gimmick of the main character assuming the identity of the client in order to draw assassination attempts to himself. Instead, Christopher Chance, the main character, inserted himself into his clients' lives to become the human target. Mark Valley played Chance and was joined by Chi McBride as his business partner, Watchmen's Jackie Earle Haley as a hired gun, Game of Thrones' Indira Verma as Chance's benefactor, and Janet Montgomery as a thief on a redemption arc. The show ran 2 seasons with 25 total episodes on Fox, being canceled in May of 2011. It was met with mixed reviews, with most seeing the show as largely harmless action fun. It met its doom mostly because of changes made for the second season, many at the time believing the show was forced to add female characters to appeal to women. Much like shows and movies today, it failed to do that while driving away men. The same summer, DC's Jonah Hex made it to theaters as a live-action flick starring Josh Brolin, who would play Marvel's Thanos in various films between 2014 and 2019, as well as the X-Men character Cable in Deadpool 2. The movie is set in the Civil War era, following the story of Jonah, a Confederate soldier who disobeys his commanding officer's order to burn down a hospital, killing the officer's son in the process. Quentin Turnbull, the officer, played by screen legend John Malkovich, retaliates by killing Hex's family and branding Hex's face. He is found near death by the Crow people and healed, learning he can now communicate with the dead. He fakes his death in a fire and becomes a bounty hunter. Some years later, he winds up being hired by President Grant to stop a plot being carried out by Turnbull and his minions to attack the Capitol on the 4th of July. Besides Malkovich and Brolin, the cast also included Megan Fox, Michael Fassbender, Will Arnett, Michael Shannon, Wes Bentley, Lance Reddick, and Aidan Quinn as President Ulysses Grant. The story and the cast should have meant it was a fairly good movie. Alas, it was a train wreck. It brought in $11 million total at theaters on a $47 million budget, receiving nearly no international play based on its reception at the domestic box office. It was so bad, one reviewer at the time said, quote, "The 81 minutes, including credits, of Jonah Hex footage that made it to the screen looked like something assembled under a tight deadline, and possibly under the influence," unquote. Jonah Hex was nominated for Worst Actress for Megan Fox and Worst Screen Couple for Josh Brolin's face and Megan Fox's accent at the 31st Golden Raspberry Awards. The writers of this abomination would be grabbed up by Sony to direct Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance, the very next year, showing that Hollywood has been all in on the failing upward model for a while now. The box office stink continued the very next year, as Green Lantern would be given the live-action treatment with Ryan Reynolds starring as Hal Jordan in the summer of 2011. Spending $200 million to film the movie and at least another $100 million to market the effort, Green Lantern would only bring in a total of $220 million worldwide, making Warner Bros. And DC abandon the laughable movie's sequel setup. While there was nothing overly wrong with the movie, there was very little to point out as right. It was too full of CGI, even before the era of Marvel CGIing the shit out of everything. It was too jokey, a few years before Marvel felt the need to shove a joke in every square page of the script. And the script was thin, even though it is based on a character with over 7 decades worth of history in the comics. The lore was spread thin over the movie, and the villain, which should have been awesome, was relegated to being a scientist who was probably somewhere on the spectrum, and a malevolent cloud that was beaten fairly easily, despite being someone the entire Green Lantern Corps was scared shitless enough of to bail out on Hal when he asked for help saving Earth. However, Ryan Reynolds' performance would give 20th Century Fox the confidence to let him reprise his role as Marvel's Deadpool, to good effect a few years later. While this era of DC would wind down on a high note with a success, it was still a disappointing success. In July of 2012, The Caped Crusader was back with Christopher Nolan's finale to his Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises. The movie opened mildly retarded, and there was kind of a patina of retarded throughout the movie, despite the overall movie being good enough to earn over $1 billion at the worldwide box office on a budget that was in the neighborhood of $250 million. Given the high expectations stoked by the excellent Batman Begins and the masterpiece that was The Dark Knight, the third installment left viewers feeling wanting? It was a kind of depressing end to a trilogy whose previous entries had fans stoked for the future of Batman. It opened with a puzzling hijacking of a plane by Bane in order to kidnap a scientist. Then we find we are 8 years after the death of Harvey Dent, where organized crime has largely been eliminated thanks to expanded police powers following the death. Batman has become a recluse and Wayne Enterprises has stagnated. In furtherance to Bane's overall plan, Bane hires someone to hire Catwoman to obtain Bruce Wayne's fingerprints. Now, the next part of this is fucking retarded because shit does not work this way. Bane attacks the stock exchange in order to take Bruce Wayne's money using those fingerprints, leaving him bankrupt. Because of course, billionaires' finances are solely in stocks and bank accounts that can be hacked via fingerprints. Anyway, Bruce dons the Batman gear once more to face Bane, loses, and gets tossed in a literal hole in the ground, a prison in the Middle East where Bane and Ra's al Ghul's child was imprisoned. In the fight with Bane, Bruce's back was broken, which he somehow fixes by working out in his cell. Fixes well enough to escape by climbing the walls of the hole in the ground that only one person has ever managed, Ra's al Ghul's child, of course. While Bruce is working out, Bane takes Gotham hostage, blowing up all the bridges in the city and holding kangaroo trials for the elites of the city, presided over by Jonathan Crane, aka Scarecrow. Dent's crimes as Two-Face are also exposed since Commissioner Gordon was stupid enough to write them down. Bane uses the scientist that he kidnapped at the beginning to turn a fusion reactor into a bomb before killing him. The one holding Bane's leash turns out to be Ra's al Ghul's kid, Talia, also Bruce's love interest. She plans to destroy Gotham, finishing her father's work. Bruce gets out of the prison, somehow makes his way to Gotham, somehow gets into the city, somehow finds Confederates, including Catwoman, rallies more followers, and attacks the heavily armed forces of Bane. And wins. Of course. Catwoman saves him from Bane and Talia after Talia stabs Batman. The two rush to save the city from the bomb, but learn the only way is to get it as far from Gotham as possible. Batman takes it in the Batplane and is last seen flying eastward into the rising sun before the bomb explodes. Everyone assumes he's dead. Batman is honored as a hero, and the Wayne Manor is turned into an orphanage. Gordon finds the bat signal repaired, and Lucius Fox finds the autopilot on the Batplane was repaired. Alfred, on vacation in Florence, Italy, discovers Bruce is alive, and in a relationship with Selina Kyle, as they are seated not far away where he is at a cafe. They silently acknowledge each other and go about their business. Robin Blake, a police officer who was also an orphan and helped in the battle for the city, finds out that he was given a bequeathal from Bruce Wayne. He resigns from GCPD and follows coordinates that were in a package that he received, finding the Batcave. Part of the disappointment so many fans of Nolan's trilogy felt after The Dark Knight Rises was the fact that the final scene that seemed to set up Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Robin, or Batman's successor in a follow-up movie, was never, followed up. There are many, many story elements to the film that are also disappointing. Among them were the vague connection to the League of Shadows of the first movie, Bane, just all of Bane, scientific problems in the plot, and the whole of the ending. While there are some of these that can be dismissed on an artistic choice grounds, others are not so easily countered. And when people tried, the film became an early example of critics and Rotten Tomatoes circling the wagons around Hollywood studios in opposition to the fans. The movie The Dark Knight Rises tried to set up with Levitt as Robin was also something of a disappointment. Levitt was good in the movie and would have made a good Robin in a Nolan-esque DC movie. The political overtones of the movie were also noticed by Hollywood, but generally ignored as much as they could bring themselves to do so, since they pointed out the reign of terror tendency of anti-capitalist movements that succeed, turning Gotham into a terror-ridden shithole. Overall, it was an ambitious movie that tried to do many things, succeeded in some, but overall left an aftertaste in viewers' minds that was not overly pleasant. Which I guess sums up the first decade and change from DC and Warner Brothers on television and at movie theaters. It was a time that did two things for DC. Disappoint at almost every turn, with the exception of Smallville, Constantine, and Nolan's Batman trilogy, and set nearly unreachable goalposts for creators coming up in the following years. 3 unqualified hits in a little over a decade is pretty bad for a major studio like Warner Brothers. Of course, other subsidiaries within Warner would help cover that, but DC was dragging on the WB. Meanwhile, over at their nearly century-old rivals Marvel, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was just getting revved up for a run that would see Disney buy them up and continue to coast into Hollywood history with an interconnected movie universe of over 30 films grossing tens of billions of dollars that saw nothing but gold falling from the heavens and into Marvel Studios' coffers. Warner Brothers, not one to take such success lying down, and DC, not one to see Marvel succeed with something without trying to rip it off, got to work coming up with their own universes. It still did not erase an era that largely saw nothing but humiliation from DC. An era where they tried different styles and characters and target audiences, largely to no avail. And it is perhaps because they could not commit that caused them so much trouble. After all, some of those flops were simply ill-timed and victims of Hollywood fate. Others were simply not released into an environment ready to take in what they were offering. Yet others would probably have needed only minor tweaking to have turned audience-rejected disappointment into entertainment goldmine. However, the combo of DC failure after failure, with only Batman bringing in Marvel levels of success, paired with that Marvel success, seemed to turn the executives at DC more than a little trigger-happy where changing course was concerned. But then, if you watched my previous video, you will remember that this is an epidemic at Warner Brothers DC. It was just such vacillation of tone and character with the Batman series in the 1990s that wound up sinking the character for a decade. Tim Burton had created two of the greatest comic book movies of all time, but the tone was too dark for the sponsors of Warner Brothers. So, they chucked the formula that was popular with audiences overboard and went with something akin to the 1960s campy Batman, driving said audiences away. This decade of doom with audiences of the new millennium would not get that bad. However, DC and Warner Brothers executives would take all the wrong lessons from their first decade and change with movie theater audiences. They would look with envy at Marvel and take the wrong lessons from their first decade at the box office. They would scan the box office net figures for DC and take all the wrong lessons. And there were lessons to be had from the 2000s and very early 2010s for Hollywood executives who were paying attention and had half a brain to understand those lessons. Alas, as my blunt foreshadowing hinted, DC and Warner Brothers were not in overabundant supply of such executives. Much like the previous era, DC had unbelievable highs and lows that made you sit back and say, "Holy shit, was that terrible?" They learned what to do with new levels of CGI, but were still not getting the story and characters right in far too many movies. Comic book movies have a simple formula that seems way too complicated for the simpletons in Hollywood. Adapt the characters and locations as close to what is shown in the good eras of comic books, and write compelling stories that let those characters act like they do in the eras of good comic books. Sadly, Hollywood finds that either too difficult or simply cannot resist the temptation to take something good and let their egos out to play, warping something from the comic books into something from their own personalities, lives, issues, or politics. In this first decade and change of the 21st century, it was mostly the former. The latter will come into play more and more as we get into our final era of DC on film. But that is another video. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment down below. The next installment should be along shortly. Until then, tschüss.